It was a city of wonders. Floating gardens, shimmering temples, bustling markets with chocolate, jade, obsidian, and blood. Tenochtitlan wasn't just a capital. It was a world engineered for war worship and sacrifice. Before we dive into the ritual that boiled Aztec elites alive, yes, you heard that right, we need to understand the world that made such a horror not just possible, but sacred. A city built on the bones of gods. Founded in 1325 on a swampy island in Lake Texcoco, Tenochtitlan became the beating heart of the Aztec Empire. It rivaled the grandeur of Rome and the complexity of Constantinople, but with a pulse of its own. Everything in this world pointed upward toward the gods. Temples were pyramids. Emperors were living demigods. And the highest honor one could give to the heavens was blood. For the Aztecs, blood was currency. It fed the sun, protected the crops, and kept the stars from falling. But not all blood was equal. There was ordinary blood from prisoners, slaves, and criminals. And then there was sacred blood. Sacred blood, sacred flames. The Aztecs believed that the more noble the victim, the more powerful the offering. To kill a commoner was a gesture. To kill a noble, that was a cosmic transaction. This belief set the stage for the ritual you're about to learn, one so extreme. It was reserved for the elite only. And in the empire's final decades, this ritual would reach horrifying new heights. But what drove a civilization to boil its own aristocracy alive? It wasn't madness. It was meaning. To the Aztecs, the world was always on the brink of destruction. They believed we lived in the fifth sun, a cosmic era destined to end like the four before it, in flood, fire, jaguars, or darkness. If the gods bled to create the world, then man must bleed to preserve it. Everything from war to weather to harvests was tied to divine appeasement. A drought? The gods are angry. A plague? More blood must be spilled. A solar eclipse? You better sacrifice something valuable fast. And that brings us to one of the most feared and sacred rituals of all, the Zayp-Totec ritual. A ceremony where noble captives weren't just executed. They were boiled. Alive, not as punishment, but as transformation. Before you can understand why boiling was sacred, you have to meet the god who demanded it. Zayp-Totec, the flayed one. He was the god of agricultural renewal, skin regeneration, rebirth through pain. His worshippers were the flayed skins of sacrificed humans to symbolize the shedding of the old self. It was gruesome. It was holy. It was necessary. The earth must be cut to grow crops. So the body must be flayed to grow the soul. So now you understand. The Aztecs saw noble blood as divine fuel. They saw suffering as sacred. And in their most solemn rites, the highest offering wasn't death itself, but how you died. And for the Aztec elite, the ultimate honor and horror was to die in the boiling vats of Zayp-Totec. The question is not why they were killed, but why they volunteered. The ritual of boiling step by step inside the sacred slaughter. This was not a public execution. It was not meant to terrorize the masses. It was a gift to the gods, conducted with precision, reverence, and heat. The victims of this ritual were not criminals. They were warriors, nobles, and even priests taken captive in ritual wars known as flower wars. Why them? Because the gods demanded the finest. To offer a poor man would be an insult. To offer a rich man, that was a sacred transaction. In some cases, the captives were even treated like royalty for weeks before their death, bathed in flower water, fed exotic foods, adorned in ceremonial clothes. They were called Exiptla, living representations of the gods. But in the end, their path led not to a throne, but to the flames. At the foot of the temple of Totec, the priest lit a ceremonial fire beneath an enormous clay boiling vessel, often lined with obsidian, and filled with ritual herbs and oil. This was not clean water. It was a concoction designed to symbolize rebirth through destruction. The noble captive would be brought forward. Chants would begin low, rhythmic, echoing across the plaza. He who enters the fire emerges with the gods. There was no scream, because they had been trained not to cry out. To scream was to dishonor the offering. Then, with ceremony, the boiling began. Modern minds recoil at the image. Human flesh boiling in a vessel, steam rising into the sky. But to the Aztecs, this was alchemical. Flesh melts. Spirit rises. The noble wasn't dying. He was ascending, being reshaped in the crucible of the gods. And when the ritual was complete, the remains were divided. The bones were cleaned. The skin sometimes was worn by priests in the following rites. The act wasn't hidden. It was enshrined in murals, codices, songs, because it symbolized everything the Aztecs believed: life through death, growth through pain, power through offering. To a foreign eye, this was barbarism. But to the Aztec worldview, it was necessity. No crop grows without the death of the seed, and no god blesses without the price of pain. This is why even elites volunteered. Some noble families offered their sons not out of cruelty, but out of honor. Because to die for the gods was not a tragedy. It was legacy. Legacy of a boiling god. The ritual didn't survive the conquest. When Hearn and Court S. and his men arrived, they were horrified at what they saw. The Spanish chroniclers wrote of skinless priests, pools of steaming blood, and unspeakable rites. They burned the temples. They melted the golden masks. They outlawed the rituals. But whispers remained. Some say the spirit of Totec lives on in the fire, in every scar, in every act of sacrifice for something greater than the self. Was it truly about faith? Or was there something else beneath the surface, beneath the boiling water and sacred chants? What if these gruesome rituals were not just acts of worship, but instruments of power? Not just offerings to gods, but warnings to men? At first glance, human sacrifice seems purely religious. But when we study the scale, the targets, and the timing, something becomes clear. These were also tools of governance, especially the boiling ritual. Who was chosen? Noble warriors, rising political rivals, captured elites from neighboring city-states. This was not just about pleasing gods. It was about demonstrating who held the divine license to kill. Imagine you're a noble from a rival city invited to witness a ritual in Tenochtitlan. You stand in the great plaza. The emperor appears on the temple steps. Below him, a man of your own status, your own rank being offered to the gods in a cauldron of flame. What message does that send? You may be powerful in your land, but here, your status means nothing if the emperor wills it. This was ritualized dominance, divine theater, with a political agenda. The Aztecs ruled over a vast empire of vassal states, many of whom despised them. How do you hold power without an army in every village? Terror, symbolism, spectacle. The boiling ritual was rare. That's why it worked. It was the ultimate example of what happens when one defies or threatens the center. 100 laws are not as powerful as one unforgettable image. Here's a deeper layer. Even within Tenochtitlan, the boiling ritual may have served to discipline the elite themselves. An ambitious noble gaining too much influence? A general too beloved by his troops? A priest with secret loyalties? They wouldn't be exiled. They'd be honored with a sacred death. This tactic wrapped political assassination in spiritual silk. If your death is declared holy, who dares question it? Thus, Fear was institutionalized, power was preserved, and all was done in the name of the gods. Spanish chroniclers like Bernal Díaz del Castillo couldn't see the nuance. To them, the ritual was diabolical, barbaric, inhuman, but they missed the real brilliance. Because behind the fire was a system of control. Behind the gods was a throne. And behind every ritual was a ruler. For centuries, the Aztec elite played the game. They funded the rituals. They led the wars. They offered the sacrifices. But what happens when the blade turns toward you? At some point in the final years before the Spanish arrived, the very system the Aztecs used to control power began to unravel. Not because outsiders attacked it, but because insiders no longer believed. By the late 1400s, the Aztec Empire had expanded far beyond its original basin. It now stretched from the Gulf of Mexico to the Pacific Ocean. But with that growth came a problem. Too many elites, not enough thrones. Sons of nobles were promised priesthoods or governorships. Military leaders demanded land and tribute. Rival families within Tenochtitlan began vying for influence. And in this volatile mix, some began to resent the rituals. Why must we keep feeding the gods with our own? Why should my son die to please a fire we did not light? The boiling ritual, once seen as a sacred honor, became a source of dread, especially for those close enough to the emperor to know anyone can be next. It didn't help that certain sacrifices became suspicious. Nobles who spoke too loudly in court, generals who won too much glory, high priests who refused to endorse imperial policies. One by one, some found themselves arrested quietly, declared possessed or chosen, boiled alive in the name of Zayp, Totec. The public was told it was divine will, but the elite began to whisper, "This is not piety. This is politics in a mask." Rebellion wasn't immediate. It was slow, more like erosion than explosion. Secret alliances were formed among noble houses. Tribute was withheld. Prayers were spoken, but no longer believed. Some priests quietly refused to conduct the boiling rites. Some provinces demanded that their elites be spared from death by flame, and the emperor, he began to rule with more fear and more fire, because when a system starts to crack, the instinct is not to reform it. It's to burn it brighter. By the early 1500s, some subject city-states had grown so resentful of the constant demand for sacrifices they rose up. One of the most famous? Tlaxcala, a fierce independent state that had fought the Aztecs for decades. They were supposed to provide warriors to be sacrificed. Instead, they began preparing for war. The boiling ritual had become a symbol of oppression. No longer sacred, no longer respected, only feared. And as fear curdled into hatred, the empire itself began to rot from within. So when Cortes landed in 1519, he didn't face a united empire. He faced an empire cracking at its core. And guess who helped him? Tlaxcalan warriors, former Aztec nobles. The elites who once whispered, now shouted, better to die by a foreign sword than in a native fire. That's how far the ritual had fallen. From sacred ceremony to symbol of tyranny, from holy death to political execution, from belief to rebellion. The flames died down, the cauldrons cooled, and for the first time in centuries, no one boiled in the name of Zayp, Totec. The Spanish didn't just conquer cities, they conquered beliefs. And in the ruins of Tenochtitlan, they didn't only find gold, they found temples soaked in blood. When Herne and Cortes entered Tenochtitlan in 1519, he was both horrified and fascinated. Spanish chronicles describe altars layered in dried blood, priests in flayed skins, cauldrons still warm from the last sacrifice. To the conquistadors, this wasn't just barbarism, it was a spiritual war. Cortés didn't simply topple thrones, he toppled gods. Idols were torn down, sacred fires were extinguished, temples were burned and rebuilt as churches. And the boiling ritual? Gone. Outlawed. Punishable by death. The sacred had become illegal. To the Spaniards, this was a victory. But to the indigenous people, even those who had turned against the empire, it was the end of a world. No more temple music. No more sacred festivals. No more warriors reborn through flame. Totec, the god of rebirth through pain, was silenced. The fires that once lit the path to the divine now lit only the dark corners of memory. Some wept. Some converted. Some kept the gods alive in secret. In place of flayed priests came robed missionaries. In place of cauldrons came crucifixes. And the language of sin replaced the language of sacrifice. But irony lingers. Because the new faith brought its own rituals of fear, inquisitions, public executions, torture for heresy, the gods changed. The flames remained. By the 1600s, the memory of Totec faded into folklore. Only a few codices, scattered murals, and whispered stories remained. And the boiling ritual? Discredited, demonized, forgotten by most. But here's the strange part. Even centuries later, some descendants of the Aztec world still remember. Not the details, not the theology, but the feeling that there was once a time when pain had purpose, when the fire purified, when to be chosen even to die meant something greater than fear. So what are we to make of it today? A civilization that boiled its own elite alive. In the name of cosmic balance. Was it madness? Was it devotion? Or was it something we no longer understand? One thing is clear: to judge the past only by the comfort of the present is to forget that belief is the oldest form of power. From the ashes of Tenochtitlan, the world moved on, but the flame, the idea that pain unlocks something higher, still flickers. Sometimes in politics, sometimes in religion, sometimes deep in the human psyche.